Hi, and welcome to today's sleep story. I'm Serena, and today I'll be reading part 2 of The Hunter's Wife, written by author Anthony Doerr. Today's story will guide you into a deep and relaxing sleep. That winter was the worst he could remember. From Thanksgiving on, they were snowed in, the truck buried under 6-foot drifts. The phone line went down in December and stayed down until April. January began with a chinook, followed by a terrible freeze. The next morning, a 3-inch crust of ice covered the snow. On the ranches to the south, cattle crashed through and bled to death, kicking their way out. Deer punched through with their tiny hooves and suffocated in the deep snow beneath. Trails of blood veined the hills. In the mornings, he would find coyote tracks written in the snow around the door to the crawl space, 2 inches of hardwood between them, and all his winter hoard hanging frozen beneath the floorboards. He reinforced the door with baking sheets, nailing them up against the wood and over the hinges. Twice he woke to the sound of claws scrabbling against the metal and charged outside to shout the coyotes away. Everywhere he looked, something was dying. An elk keeling over, an emaciated doe clattering onto ice like a drunken skeleton. The radio reported huge cattle losses on the southern ranches. Each night he dreamt of wolves, of running with them, soaring over fences, and tearing into the steaming carcasses of cattle. In February, he woke to coyotes under the cabin. He grabbed his bow and knife and dashed out into the snow barefoot, his feet going numb. They had gone in under the door, chewing and digging the frozen earth under the foundation. He unbolted what was left of the door and swung it free. Elk arrows were all he had, aluminium shafts tipped with broadheads. He squatted in the dark entrance, their only exit, with his bow at full draw and an arrow nocked. Above him, he could hear his wife's feet pad quietly over the floorboards. A coyote making a coughing sound. Others shifted and panted. Maybe there were 10. He began to fire arrows steadily into the dark. He heard some bite into the foundation blocks at the back of the crawl space. Others sink into the flesh. He spent his whole quiver, 12 arrows. The yelps of speared coyotes went up. A few charged him, and he lashed at them with his knife. He felt teeth go into the bone of his arm, felt hot breath on his cheeks. He lashed with his knife at ribs, tails, skulls. His muscles screamed. The coyotes were in a frenzy. Blood bloomed from his wrist, his thigh. She heard the otherworldly screams of wounded coyotes come up through the floorboards, his grunts and curses as he fought. It sounded as if an exit had been tunnelled all the way from hell to open up under their house, and what was now pouring out was the worst violence that place could send up. She knelt in front of the fireplace and felt the souls of coyotes as they came through the boards on their way skyward. He was blood-soaked and hungry, and his thigh had been badly bitten, but he worked all day digging out the truck. If he did not get food, they would starve, and he tried to hold the thought of the truck in his mind. He lugged slate and tree bark to wedge under the tyres, excavated a mountain of snow from the truck bed. Finally, after dark, he got the engine turned over and ramped the truck up onto the frozen, wind-crusted snow. For a brief, wonderful moment, he had it careening over the icy crust, starlight washing through the windows, tyres spinning, pistons churning, what looked to be the road unspooling in the headlights. Then he crashed through, slowly, painfully. He began digging it out again. It was hopeless. He would get it up, and then it would break through a few miles later. Hardly anywhere was the sheet of ice atop the snow thick enough to support the truck's weight. For 20 hours, he dug, and then revved, and slid the truck over 8-foot drifts. 3 more times it crashed through and sank to the windows. Finally, he left it. He was 10 miles from home, 30 miles from town. He made a weak and smoky fire with cut boughs and lay beside it and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. The heat from the fire melted snow, and trickles ran slowly towards him, but froze solid before they reached him. The stars twisting in their constellations above had never seemed further or colder. In a state that was neither fully asleep nor fully waking, he watched wolves lope around his fire, just outside the reaches of light, slavering and lean. He thought for the first time that he might die if he did not get warmer. He managed to kneel and turn and crawl for home. Around him, he could feel the wolves, smell blood on them, hear their nailed feet scrape across ice. He travelled all that night and all the next day, near Cattonia, sometimes on his feet, more often on his elbows and knees. At times he thought he was a wolf, and at times he thought he was dead. When he finally made it to the cabin, there were no tracks on the porch, no sign that she'd gone out. The crawl space door was still flung open, and shreds of the siding and the door frame lay scattered about. She was kneeling on the floor, ice in her hair, lost in some kind of hypothermic torpor. With his last dregs of energy, he constructed a fire and poured a mug of hot water down her throat. As he fell into sleep, he watched himself, as from a distance, weeping and clutching his near-frozen wife. They had only flour and a few crackers in the cupboards. When she could speak, her voice was quiet and far away. "I've dreamt the most amazing things," she murmured. "I've seen the places where coyotes go when they are gone. I know where spiders go and geese." Snow fell incessantly. Night was abiding, Daylight passed in a breath. The hunter was beyond hungry. Whenever he stood up, his eyesight fled in slow, nauseating streaks of colour. He went out with lanterns to fish, shovelled down the river ice, chopped through it with a maul, and shivered over the whole jigging, a ball of dough on a hook. Sometimes he brought back a trout. Other times they ate a squirrel, a hare, once a famished deer whose bones he cracked and boiled, or only a few handfuls of rose hips. In the worst parts of March, he dug out cattails to peel and steam the tubers. She hardly ate, sleeping 18-20 hours a day. When she woke, it was to scribble on notebook paper before plummeting back into sleep, clutching at the blankets as if they gave her sustenance. She was learning, strength hidden at the centre of weakness, ground at the bottom of her deepest pit. With her stomach empty and her body quieted, without the daily demands of living, she felt she was making important discoveries. She was only 19 and had lost 20 pounds since marrying him. Naked, she was all ribcage and pelvis. He read her scribbled dreams, but they seemed to be senseless poems and gave him no clues to her. Snail sleds down stones in the rain. Owl fixes his eyes on hair, drops as if from the moon. Horse rides across the plains with his brothers. In April, the temperature rose above 0 and then above 20. He strapped an extra battery to his pack and went to dig out the truck. Its excavation took all day. He drove it slowly back up the slushy road in the moonlight and asked if she'd like to go to town the next morning. To his surprise, she said yes. They heated water for baths and dressed in clothes they hadn't worn in 6 months. She threaded twine through her belt loops to keep her trousers up. Behind the wheel, his chest filled to have her with him, to be moving out into the country, to see the sun above the trees. Spring was coming. The valley was dressing up. Look there, he wanted to say. Those geese streaming over the road. The valley lives, even after a winter like that. She asked him to drop her off at the library. He bought food, 12 frozen pizzas, potatoes, eggs, carrots. He nearly wept at seeing bananas. In the parking lot, he drank half a gallon of milk. When he picked her up at the library, she'd applied for a library card and borrowed 20 books. They stopped at the Bitterroot for hamburgers and rhubarb pie. She ate 3 pieces. He watched her eat, the spoon sliding out of her mouth. This was better. This was more like his dreams. Well, Mary, he said, I think we made it. I love pie, she said. As soon as the line was repaired, the phone began to ring. He took his fishing clients down the river. She sat on the porch, reading. Soon her sudden and ravenous appetite for books could not be met by the Great Falls Public Library. She wanted other books, essays about sorcery, primers on magic working, and conjury that had to be mail-ordered from New Hampshire, New Orleans, even Italy. Once a week the hunter drove to town to collect a parcel of books from the post office. Arsana Mundi, the Sears Dictionary, Paragon of Wizardry, Occult Science Among the Ancients. He opened one to a random page and read, "Bring water, tie a soft fillet around your altar, burn it on fresh twigs and frankincense." She regained her health, took on energy, no longer lay under furs dreaming all day. She was out of bed before he was, brewing coffee, her nose already between pages. With a steady diet of meat and vegetables, her body bloomed, her hair shone, her eyes and cheeks glowed. How beautiful she seemed to him in those few hours he was home. After supper, he would watch her read in the firelight, blackbird feathers tied all through her hair, a heron's beak hanging between her breasts. In November, he took a Sunday off and they cross-country skied. They came across a bull elk, frozen to death in a draw. Ravens shrieked at them as they skied to it. She knelt and put her palm on the leathered skull. "There," she moaned. "I feel him." "What do you feel?" he asked, standing behind her. "What is it?" She stood, trembling. "I feel his life flowing out," she said. "I see where he goes, what he sees." "But that's impossible," he said. "It's like saying you know what I dream." "I do," she said. "You dream about wolves." "But that elk's been dead at least a day. It doesn't go anywhere. It goes into the crops of those ravens." How could she tell him? How could she ask him to understand such a thing? How could anyone understand? More clearly than ever, she could see that there was a fine line between dreams and wakefulness, between living and dying. A line so tenuous it sometimes didn't exist. It was always clearest for her in winter. In winter, in that valley, life and death were not so different. The heart of a hibernating newt was frozen solid, but she could warm and wake it in her palm. For the newt there was no line at all, no fence, no river Styx, only an area between living and dying, like a snowfield between two lakes, a place where dreams and wakefulness met, where death was only a possibility, and visions rose, shimmering to the stars like smoke. All that was needed was a hand, the heat of a palm, the touch of fingers. That February, the sun shone during the days, and ice formed at night. Slick sheets glazing the wheat fields, the roofs and roads. One day he dropped her off at the library. the chains on the tyres rattling as he pulled away, heading back up the Missouri toward Fort Benton. Around noon, Marlin Spokes, a snowplow driver the hunter knew from grade school, slid off the Sun River Bridge in his plow and dropped 40 feet into the river. He was dead before they could get him out of the truck. She was reading in the library, a block away, and heard the plow crash into the riverbed, like 1,000 dropped girders. When she got to the bridge, sprinting in her jeans and t-shirt, men were already in the water. A telephone man from Helena, a jeweler, a butcher in his apron. All of them had scrambled down the banks and were wading in the rapids, prying the door open. The men lifted Marlin from the cab, stumbling as they carried him. Steam rose from their shoulders and from the crushed hood of the plough. She careened down the snow-covered slope and splashed to them, her hand on the jeweller's arm, her leg against the butcher's leg. She reached for Marlin's ankle. When her finger touched Marlin's body, her eyes rolled back, and a single vision leaped to her. Marlin Spokes, pedalling a bicycle, a child's seat mounted over the rear tyre with a helmeted boy, Marlin's own son, strapped into it. Spangles of light drifted over the riders as they rolled down a lane beneath giant, sprawling maples. The boy reached for Marlin's hair with one small fist. In the glass of a storefront window, their reflection flashed past. Fallen leaves turned over in their wake. This quiet vision, like a ribbon of rich silk, ran out slowly and fluidly, with great power, and she shook beneath it. It was she who pedalled the bike. The boy's fingers pulled through her hair. The men who were touching her or touching Marlin saw what she saw, felt what she felt. At first they spoke of it only in their basements, at night. But Great Falls was not a big town, and this was not something one could keep locked in a basement. Soon they discussed it everywhere. In the supermarket, at the gasoline pumps. People who didn't know Marlin Spokes or his son, or the hunter's wife, or any of the men in the river that morning, soon spoke of the event like experts. All you had to do was touch her, a barber said, and you saw it too. The most beautiful lane you've ever dreamed, a deli owner raved. You didn't just peddle his son around, movie ushers whispered. You loved him. He could have heard anywhere. In the cabin he built up the fire, flipped idly through a stack of her books. He couldn't understand them. One of them wasn't even in English. After dinner, she took the plates to the sink. You read Spanish now? He asked. Her hands in the sink stilled. It's Portuguese, she said. I understand only a little. He turned his fork in his hands. Were you there when Marlon Spokes was killed? I helped pull him out of the truck. I don't think I was much good. He looked at the back of her head. He felt like driving his fork through the table. What tricks did you play? Did you hypnotize people? Her shoulders tightened. Her voice came out furious. Why can't you? She began, but her voice fell off. It wasn't tricks, she muttered. I helped carry him. When she started to get phone calls, he hung up on the callers, but they were relentless. A grieving widow, an orphan's lawyer, a reporter from the Great Falls Tribune. A blubbering father drove all the way to the cabin to beg her to come to the funeral parlour, and finally she went. The hunter insisted on driving her. It wasn't right, he declared, for her to go alone. He waited in the truck in the parking lot, engine rattling, radio moaning. I feel so alive, she said afterward, as he helped her into the cab. Her clothes were soaked through with sweat, like my blood is fizzing through my body. At home she lay awake, far away, all night. She got called back, and each time he drove her. He would take her after a whole day of duck hunting and pass out from exhaustion while he waited in the truck. When he woke, she would be beside him, holding his hand, her hair damp, her eyes wild. You dreamt you were with the wolves and eating salmon, she said. They were washed up and dying on the shoals. He drove them home over the dark fields. He tried to soften his voice. What do you do in there? What really? I give them solace. I let them say goodbye to their loved ones. I help them know something they'd never know otherwise. No, he said. I mean, what kind of tricks? How do you do it? She turned her hands palms up. As long as they're touching me, they see what I see. Come in with me next time. Go in there and hold hands. Then you'll know. He said nothing. The stars above the windshield seemed fixed in their places. Families wanted to pay her. Most wouldn't let her leave until they did. She would come out to the truck with $50, $100, once $400 folded into her pocket. She began to go off for weekends, disappearing in the truck before he was up, a fearless driver. She knelt by roadkill, a crumpled porcupine, a shattered deer. She pressed her palm to the truck's grill, where the husks of insects smoked. Seasons came and went. She was gone half the winter. Each of them was alone. They never spoke. On longer drives, she was sometimes tempted to keep the truck pointed away and never return. In the first thaws, he would go out by the river and try to lose himself in the rhythm of casting, in the sound of pebbles driven downstream, clacking together. But even fishing had become lonely for him. Everything, it seemed, was out of his hands. His truck, his wife, the course of his own life. As hunting season came on, his mind wandered. He was botching kills, getting upwind of elk, or telling a client to unload and call it quits 30 seconds before a pheasant bursts from cover. When a client missed his mark and pegged an antelope in the neck, the hunter berated him for being careless, knelt over its tracks, and clutched at the bloody snow. "Do you understand what you've done?" he shouted. "How the arrow shaft will knock against the trees, how the animal will run and run, how the wolves will trot behind it to keep it from resting." The client was red-faced, huffing. "Wolves don't hunt here," the client said. "There haven't been wolves here for 20 years. She was in Butte or Missoula when he discovered her money in a boot. $6,000 and change. He cancelled his trips and stewed for 2 days, pacing the porch, sifting through her things, rehearsing his arguments. When she saw him, the sheaf of bills jutting from his shirt pocket, she stopped halfway to the door, her bag over her shoulder, her hair pulled back. "It's not right," he said. She walked past him into the cabin. "I'm helping people. I'm doing what I love. Can't you see how good I feel afterward?" "You take advantage of them. They're grieving and you take their money." "They want to pay me," she shrieked. "I help them see something they desperately want to see." "It's a grift, a con." She came back out on the porch. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet and strong. "This is real as anything. The valley, the river, your trout hanging in the crawl space. I have a talent, a gift." He snorted. "A gift for hocus pocus, for swindling widows out of their savings." He lobbed the money into the yard. The wind caught the bills and scattered them over the snow. She hit him, once, hard across the mouth. "How dare you?" she cried. "You, of all people, should understand. You who dreams of wolves every night." In the months that followed, she left the cabin more frequently and for longer durations, visiting homes, accident sites, and funeral parlours all over central Montana. Finally, she pointed the truck south and didn't turn back. They had been married 5 years. "20 years later, in the Bitterroot Diner, he looked up at the ceiling-mounted television, and there she was, being interviewed. She lived in Manhattan, had travelled the world, had written 2 books. She was in demand all over the country. "Do you commune with the dead?" the interviewer asked. "No," she said. "I help people. I commune with the living. I give people peace." "Well," the interviewer said, turning to speak into the camera, "I believe it." The hunter bought her books at the bookstore and read them in one night. She'd written poems about the valley, written them to the animals. "You rampant coyote, you glorious buck." She had travelled to Sudan to touch the backbone of a fossilised stegosaur, and wrote of her frustration when she divined nothing from it. A TV network flew her to Kamchatka to embrace the huge shaggy neck of a mammoth as it was airlifted from a glacier. she'd had better luck with that one, describing an entire herd slogging big-footed through a slushy tide, tearing at seagrass and flaring their ears to catch the sun. In a handful of poems, there are even vague allusions to him. A brooding, blood-soaked presence that hovered outside the margins like a storm on its way, like a killer hiding in the basement. The hunter was 58 years old. 20 years was a long time. The valley had diminished slowly, but perceptibly. Roads came in, and the grizzlies left, seeking higher country. Loggers had thinned nearly every accessible stand of trees. Every spring runoff from logging roads turned the river chocolate brown, and the soil from the old forests was being washed into the Missouri. In his cabin, bent over the table, he set aside her books, took a pencil and wrote her a letter. A week later, a Federal Express truck drove all the way to the cabin. Inside the envelope was her response on embossed stationery. The handwriting was hurried and efficient. "I will be in Chicago," it said, "day after tomorrow. Enclosed is a plane ticket. Feel free to come. Thank you for writing." After Sherbet, the Chancellor called his guests into the reception room. Burning candles had been distributed around the room. On the sills, the banister, the mantel, the bookshelves. The bar had been taken down. In its place, 3 caskets had been set on the carpet. A bit of snow that had fallen on the lids, they must have been kept outside, was melting, and drops ran onto the carpet, where they left dark circles. Around the caskets, cushions had been placed on the floor. The hunter leaned against the entryway and watched guests drift uncomfortably into the room, some cradling coffee cups, others gulping at gin or vodka in deep tumblers. Eventually, everyone settled on the floor in a circle. The hunter's wife came in then, elegant in her dark suit. She knelt and motioned for O'Brien to sit beside her. His face was pinched and inscrutable. Again, the hunter had the impression that he was not of this world, but of a slightly leaner one. "President O'Brien," his wife said, "I know this is difficult for you. Death can seem so final, like a blade dropped through the neck. But the nature of death is not at all final. It's not some dark cliff off which we leap. I hope to show you it is merely a fog, something we can peer into and out of, something we can know and face, and not necessarily fear. By each life taken from our collective lives, we are diminished. But even in death, we have so much to celebrate. It is only a transition, like so many others." She moved into the circle and unfastened the lids of the caskets. From where he sat, the hunter could not see inside. His wife's hands fluttered around her waist like birds. "Think," she said. "Think hard about something you would like resolved. Some matter. Gone now. In the grips of the past. which you wish you could take back. Perhaps with your daughters. A moment, a lost feeling, a desperate wish. The hunter closed his eyes. Think now, his wife was saying, of some wonderful moment, some fine and sunny minute you shared, your wife and daughters, all of you together. Her voice was lulling. Behind his eyelids, the glow of the candles made an even orange wash. He knew her hands were reaching for whatever, whoever, lay in those caskets. Somewhere inside him, he felt her extend across the room. His wife said more about beauty and loss being the same thing, about how they ordered the world, and he felt something happening. A strange warmth, a flitting presence, something dim and unsettling, like a feather brushed across the back of his neck. Hands on both sides of him reached for his hands, fingers locked around his fingers. He wondered if she was hypnotizing him, but it didn't matter. He had nothing to fight off or snap out of. She was inside him now. She'd reached across and was poking about. Her voice faded, and he felt himself swept up as if rising toward the ceiling. Air washed lightly in and out of his lungs. Warmth pulsed in the hands that his held. In his mind, he saw a sea emerging from fog. The water was broad and flat, and glittered like polished metal. He could feel dune grass moving against his shins, and wind coming over his shoulders. All around him, bees shuttled over the dunes. Far out, a shorebird was driving for crabs. He knew that a few hundred yards away, 2 girls were building castles in the sand. He could hear their song, soft and lilting. Their mother was with them, reclining under an umbrella. One leg bent, the other straight. She was drinking iced tea, and he could taste it in his mouth. Sweet and bitter with a trace of mint. Each cell in his body seemed to breathe. He became the girls, the divining bird, the shuttling bees. He was the mother of the girls and the father. He could feel himself flowing outward, richly dissolving, paddling into the world like the very first sail into the great blue sea. When he opened his eyes, he saw linen curtains, women in gowns kneeling. Tears were visible on many people's cheeks. O'Brien's and the Chancellor's and Bruce Maple's. His wife's head was bowed. The hunter gently released the hands that it held, stood and walked out into the kitchen, past the sudsy sinks, the stack of dishes. He let himself out of a side door and found himself on the wooden deck that ran the length of the house. A couple of inches of snow already settled on it. He felt drawn toward the pond, the bird bath, the hedges. He walked towards the pond and stood at its rim. The snow fell steadily, and the undersides of the clouds glowed with the reflected light from the city. Before long, his wife stepped onto the deck and came down to join him. There were things he'd been preparing to say. Something about a final belief, an expression of gratitude for providing a reason to leave the valley, if only for a night. He wanted to tell her that although the wolves were gone, may always have been gone, they still came to him in his dreams. That they could run there, fierce and unfettered, was surely enough. She would understand. She had understood long before he did. But he was afraid to speak. He could see that speaking would be like dashing some very fragile bond to pieces, like kicking a dandelion gone to seed. The wispy, tenuous spear of his body would scatter in the wind. So instead they stood together, the snow fluttering down from the clouds to melt in the water, where the reflected images trembled like two people trapped against the glass of a parallel world. And he reached, finally, to take her hand.